Welcome to Table for 92. Element number 17, chlorine. It's number 17 because it has exactly 17 protons within its nucleus. For chlorine, we're cooking up an old version and a new version of the Mediterranean diet. Foods that the ancients would have eaten and foods that we eat today. Chlorine is one of those many elements that just runs the gamut on its uses from the evilest possible thing to the most sublime. Chlorine by itself is poisonous to humans, kind of like that 21 Pilots song, Chlorine. When chlorine in high amounts comes in contact with the body, it reacts with water and creates corrosive acids that are just terrible. Even though chlorine by itself messes you up, when added to sodium, it creates delicious, safe table salt, sodium chloride. It's found naturally in seaweed, rye, tomatoes, lettuce, celery, and olives, among many other foods. But it is definitely represented in the Mediterranean diet. And the best source of chlorine is just table salt, sodium chloride, but, in moderation. Chemistry is so wild though, NaCl, sodium chloride is table salt. But you put oxygen in between the sodium and the chlorine, you get bleach. Chlorine, though, is essential for human nutrition. It functions to help form digestive juices in the stomach and to keep the proper balance of bodily fluids. Chlorine is the 11th most abundant element in the lithosphere, but it is not found in a free state on Earth except in really hot temperatures and volcanic gases. In nature, chlorine is going to be found in chlorides, especially seawater. Chlorine was kind of discovered by Carl Wilhelm Scheele in 1774, but scientists and alchemists had known about hydrochloric acid for a long time. But it was Scheele who, through dripping hydrochloric acid onto manganese dioxide, created a greenish yellow gas that he did not unfortunately recognize as a new element. He believed what he had discovered contained oxygen, but that is where the name chlorine was derived from the Greek chloros, for pale green. Chlorine is part of the halogen family in the periodic table, and when ingested, it reacts with water in the body and creates acids that are corrosive and damage the cells in the body. So that's why it's used to clean water. It breaks down the chemical bonds in the molecules of bacteria, making swimming pools safe, despite all of the accidents that will happen in there. It was, and still is, used as a chemical weapon, and it started in the First World War. Actually, it was the first chemical attack in World War I on the Western Front, used by the Germans against French and French colonial troops, and it was devastatingly effective. They just had to turn an already horrible situation into hell on earth. Really quite diabolical. Chlorine gas is heavier than air, so it was used precisely to sit in the trenches to force its occupant out to more easily blow them up. It is really a terrible part of our shared history that we find ways to weaponize new discoveries so quickly, just like they did with the dinosaurs in Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. They just had to weaponize them. A lot of the foods chlorine is found in is a big part of the Mediterranean diet, one of the many reasons it's considered to be an ideal diet. However, a lot of the foods found in the modern Mediterranean diet were not actually domesticated in the Mediterranean. They were found in other parts of the world, but made it to the Mediterranean because of its central location in world trade. The original Mediterranean diet would have been much more simple than today's Mediterranean diet. They would have had a lot of olives, fish, fruits, nuts, and a lot of bread. For the bread, we take 1 cup of water and add yeast. In a separate bowl, we mix 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, 1.5 cups of einkorn flour. Einkorn flour is a very ancient grain, so it's perfect for this recipe. Then 2 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil, some salt, and some sugar. The yeast eats the sugar. Cover the dough with saran wrap and let it sit for an hour or 2 to let the dough rise. Squash, tomatoes, potatoes, chocolate, peppers, beans, corn, all were only introduced in the Mediterranean area in the last 500 years. So the diet of someone like Aristotle, who lived 2,300 years ago, would have been incredibly different than that of the modern Mediterranean diet. And now for the tzatziki sauce. First thing, we grate 1 whole cucumber and half a red onion, throw a bunch of salt in there to draw out the moisture, and let it sit for about an hour to get as much moisture out of it as possible. After an hour, we take 1 cup of whole fat yogurt, the cucumber and the onion, some minced garlic, white wine vinegar, pepper, a little bit more salt, olive oil, and some fresh dill. Now, the Mediterranean diet is super famous today as an ideal human diet, but it was really only discovered from the ashes of World War II. As soon as the fascists were in charge of Greece during World War II, they confiscated as much food as they could, because Nazis suck. So, as with the population of really any other country occupied by the fascists during World War II, the Greek civilians suffered greatly. It's estimated up to 300,000 people died of hunger and other associated illnesses during the war. The Greeks that managed to live survived by eating what they could locally. 3 years after the war, in 1948, American scientists went to the island of Crete to help rebuild and study the effects of war on the population. They were blown away at how healthy the survivors seemed to be. They expected them to be malnourished like the other populations of Europe occupied by the Nazis, but because for years they were only eating seasonal foods, usually grown themselves, and the island itself is covered in olive trees, these people were unexpectedly very healthy. So that study in 1948 was then followed up by a group of American nutritionists that came over in 1960 to study men who survived the war. See, at the time in the US, heart disease was one of the leading causes of death. And it probably didn't help that everybody was smoking 2 packs a day and drinking scotch for lunch like Don Draper style. So in the study of the Cretan men, of all of the men that they studied in over 10 years, no one died of a heart attack. This is pretty much where the Mediterranean diet found its way onto the world stage. This is a nice mix of the old Mediterranean, kind of newer Mediterranean diet. Olives, tzatziki, flatbread, that would have been a staple of their diet in the ancient times, whereas the peppers and the tomatoes are fairly new introductions to the Mediterranean diet. They would have had cucumbers and red onions back in the day as well. So this is kind of a nice mix of all this trade history together. So yeah, to recap, chlorine is essential to human health, not only for our bodies, but for disease prevention. We humans have a hard time not turning something useful into something awful. And as always, Nazis suck. Thanks, and see you next time. If you like the periodic table of elements, please hit that subscribe button.